to start with the terms of reference and just picking up again on some of the questions, some of the same gist, as they say, the questions with Mr. Rosenberger. There is also a lot of cross-sectoral work and challenges associated with understanding data and working with various uncertainties at the IHPC level also. Is that correct?
Yes.
And as I understand it, the representation that we have at the South Coast is we've got 6 for the commercial. Is that correct?
That's correct.
3 for the recreational.
Yes.
2 for the Marine Caucus Conservation.
Yeah, Marine Conservation Caucus.
Thank you. And 4 for First Nations.
Yes.
With only 2 participants of First Nations participating right now, is that correct?
The attendance on the on some of the positions has varied depending on the meetings. In the South, we've not had our full 4 participants, at least on the committee itself. We've had a number of observers attend as well.
And is it correct that the participants that do participate not as observers are very clear they're not participating with the negotiating mandate? Is that correct?
That's correct.
When were those numbers determined as to the number of representations on the committee and by whom, and how flexible are they?
I don't have the history on why the specific numbers were chosen when the committee was set up initially, but they're laid out in the May 2005 terms of reference.
And how would those numbers be changed if changing those numbers would be useful?
In terms of the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, I think we would have a discussion at the committee about the plan changes that were going to be made, and then the terms of reference could be updated as a policy decision by the department. At least that's my view on how such a change could be achieved.
Thank you. And would you agree with me that it's quite useful for representation at the IHPC to include significant technical capacity?
There's a couple ways technical capacity can be provided. The department provides technical capacity to the participants. Participants, depending on who they are, accept the advice that's provided by the department, but there are others that would prefer to have or they might have more trust if they were able to have one of their own technical participants provide the information to them.
And it's fair to say that generally speaking, in the relationship between the department and First Nations, that they often want their own technical capacity?
I find that's often the case at a number of the meetings, although in my previous role in terms of providing technical advice, I did have some success there as well. So I think it's a combination of the two.
Great, thank you. Just one other round of questions on the IHPC. As I understood it, Mr. Ronan, I just make sure I've got this right. As I heard your evidence, the first draft of roughly a 200-page document with a fair bit of technical information comes out 1 week before the first meeting. Is that correct?
The draft draft number 1 of the IFMP comes out approximately 1 week prior to the first, or to the IHPC meeting in March. Now that meeting in March is a meeting that was added. We didn't in the past have the March meeting, and it was just a review of the IFMP at the May meeting. So that one of the concerns that we heard from the participants is just having a meeting in May to do the final review and approval of the IFMP wasn't sufficient in their view to provide that feedback and advice. When the first draft of the IFMP comes out, we also do provide an opportunity for comments for approximately a 1-month period for people to come back to us with their comments and concerns.
In your evidence on January 21st, you mentioned that the department is doing some work around how we might improve the First Nations representatives in the process. Could you tell us a little bit more about what steps you're taking, what efforts you've been taking to encourage First Nations participation in your process, and how you might see that improving?
Well, I can say that First Nation participation in this committee is important. I think it's a general view of the members of the other groups, including the CSAB, SFAB, and the Marine Conservation Caucus, that it's important to have strong First Nation representation there. As you pointed out earlier, there are a number of spots on the First Nation side where attendance has not been good, and we've also had statements made that they're not specific. The First Nations that are there are not specifically mandated to represent broader groups of others. In terms of the committee itself, that's the appointments originally made were in 2004 as interim appointments, and there was a commitment to look at a way to devise a longer-term process to make those appointments. And that's something that the department's interested in following up on. Since I took over chairing the committee last year, this is an item that I've had an interest in moving forward. I did speak with our existing First Nation representation or representatives on the committees in both the North and the South over the past summer to get some of their views on how we might do this. There's a strong interest in ensuring the existing seats are filled, and also in trying to develop a process for doing that on a longer term basis. So that's currently where things sit.
A mandated Tier 1 process would help, with the technical capacity to support that, might help the representation issues on the IHPC?
Yes, I think that could be helpful.
I just wanted to check something. We can go to it if you'd like, and it's Exhibit 327. It was the memorandum that went up to the Minister recommending the IHPC for 2009. IFMP, sorry. IFMP.
Okay.
And on that, there was a sentence that said, there have been extensive consultations with commercial, recreational, and First Nation harvesters. And I was just trying to understand, given the challenges you have with representation on First Nations at the on the committee, that what would be those extensive consultations with First Nations? Are we talking about the consultations Mr. Rosenberger was talking about with general consultation with area directors and all of that? Is that what you meant when you used the words extensive consultation?
Yes, it was meant to. Oh, sorry, I interrupted there, and
no,
then I didn't hear the end of what you said.
Oh, no, that's fine. I'm actually asking, what consultations with First Nations were extensive as it related to the IFMP in 2009?
So it relates to the meetings we have with the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, the First Nation Forum, and then also bilateral meetings that are conducted in the areas between the department and First Nations.
So there might be a disagreement as to whether or not those have been extensive with First Nations. Would you agree with me on that?
I suspect there would be disagreement, yes.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add as to how we might improve the working relationship between DFO and First Nations at the kind of planning committee work that you do on harvest planning?
No, I might add on one point. I think mirroring these IHPCs or First Nation Forum processes, it's important to have similar ways to communicate the technical information between the First Nations and the department. I think that's an understanding of the information that's backing up the discussions and decisions that need to be made is an important element of making sure the processes work effectively.
It's actually one of the challenges associated with the process is actually communicating very complex information to people with different perspectives. Is that correct?
Yes, that is one of the key challenges the department and even others that are working with First Nations are challenged to try and address. We're continuing to look for new ways or other ways that information can be presented.
Thank you. Turning now to my second to last topic, and it's the topic on what's often called weak stock management, or what I might prefer to call selective or more terminal fisheries. We've heard your testimony, Mr. Rosenberger, yesterday regarding terminal fisheries and some of the moves that the department has been taking, or yesterday or last week, on things like the allocation transfer program and demonstration commercial fisheries. What are the lessons that have been learned so far from the demonstration fisheries that have been conducted over the last little while, in particular those that have been conducted within the main stem or further up on the Fraser?
Most of the effort has been trying to develop a management system that would work terminally. So we started off in some cases with fixed allocations, and we've moved to having them run based, and so they become a portion of the total level catch, the same as the other fisheries that we're managing. So we want them to be on a consistent framework. The stock identification out of some of these areas, we're able to pick up some new discrete information that we may not have had in the past. So taking a look at what the implications of those would be for fisheries. There's some fairly interesting new information that came out of the Harrison work, for example, where the First Nations Chehalis and Skowlitz First Nations, we anticipated that they would be able to harvest fish leaving the Fraser into the Harrison. In fact, they were much more successful when the fish came back out of the lake down into the Harrison River. So some of them is trying to establish the fisheries, uses of different gear. So selectivity, we're targeting to be towards gears that are the most selective that we can be in given areas, that have the either selective by the species or they have the least mortality on any released fish. I think just developing capacity in general amongst the First Nations into starting, commercial enterprises and the various business aspects that they need to develop and link into their processes. So it's been gear area trials kind of idea, the management process, some new stock information has been accrued, and the business aspects for the First Nations communities themselves.
Thank you. And just one follow-up question on that is, I call it the rate determining factor. Now, when I talk to a bunch of technical people, that might not, I might need to communicate what I mean. And what I mean is, what are the impediments, or what's determining the rate in which we can accomplish more terminal fisheries? What are our biggest challenges?
Probably developing the capacity in the areas at this stage. Was a fairly significant breakthrough this last year in the interior, the Shuswap Thompson side of things, where the harvest was around 200,000 fish. So we've had demonstration fishery attempts in 5 or 6 areas over probably for 5 or 6 years, so that there's a number of them, and in most cases the harvesting was well below the desired outcomes, so the allocation that was provided to those given fisheries. So I think that for many of the groups, it's trying to figure out where and how they want to fish, and if this is not clear, I mean, if you have a dip, many of the First Nations fisheries in a lot of areas were dip net only fisheries. So if you have an objective, as the Shuswap Thompson fishery share last year was close to 1 million fish, and you're dip netting, you're going to have awfully strong arms and back when you're done, and you're probably not going to have all the fish that you would hope for. So moving to, in this case, it was a seine boat operating in a lake. That's probably never occurred in the history of the interior ever. We did demonstration fisheries with traps, trying to utilize some of the traditional knowledge of the First Nations, and most of them had fairly limited success. So they needed to look for something else. Beach seining has been proven fairly successful, but trying to find areas where you could function, some of the areas where they thought they would, so they need to move around in the river quite a bit to find areas. So I think the capacity to harvest and the understanding workings of the gear, I think is going to be a growing experience, but I think that there's it's something that's some fairly good strides for in the last year in particular.
Thank you.
If I could add one point to what Barry had said, It hasn't been an impediment to date, but the allocations or the shares we're providing First Nations for these demonstration fisheries are coming from licenses that are held in the department's inventory. So these are licenses that have been purchased from the commercial, the existing commercial fleets, and I don't use the word retired on purpose because the intention of the department purchasing those licenses is to reallocate them to First Nations for the purposes of demonstration fisheries. In the years we've done demonstration fisheries, we've used licenses in the inventory that were bought back either through the allocation transfer program or through the more recently the Pacific Integrated Commercial Fisheries Initiative. And so those where I'm going with this is we repurchase these licenses and then we determine what the shares of salmon are associated with those for providing to inland fisheries. And I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but for Fraser sockeye this past year, I think we had in the range of 12 to 13% of the commercial TAC associated with those licenses. Barry mentioned that the groups weren't able to harvest that amount of fish, but in the future there may be capacity developed to do that and or interest for increased allocations.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I
could add another thing here, if it might help, but another item is, and that is that the Fraser sockeye are cyclic by the different streams and so the tributaries, and so you have a in the Thompson drainage, for example, there's two very strong sockeye years and there's two relatively weak sockeye years, and that's true for a number of the different systems. And one of the issues right now is that most of the First Nations are trying to develop this capacity. All of them want to have the same level of capacity, those that are interested in participating in it. And if you purchase the equipment, get yourself engaged in this, and you only have a business 2 out of 4 years, for example, you're probably not going to have as successful a business as you might want. And so some of them are trying to only develop to the level of the weaker years in some cases and not necessarily taking full advantage of what might be there on a run-based linkage. So one of our challenges has been trying to get them to want to be a part of a larger co-op aggregate, some kind of a process, and fairly limited progress has been made on that side of things at this stage. The other thing I would clear up is my numbers weren't all that good this morning on the panel part. So it's there's 5 commercial fishermen representing one of each of the licensed gear areas. There's 1 processor, and then I did provide there's 3 First Nations, 1 rec, and 2 DFO.
Thank you. Just have this question. Is it been your experience with the terminal fisheries, this is one area that First Nations and DFO have a common interest?
Definitely some of the First Nations. Some of them are not interested in the commercial fishing aspect or moving it terminally.
And those First Nations that do have an interest in moving it closer to the terminal grounds and working in commercial and including commercial purposes are very interested in working to get these implemented on the ground?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Can I maybe add one point? One of the concerns that's been raised with First Nations at some of our meetings, particularly among Marine First Nations, is that their commercial harvesting capacity is closely linked to their ability to harvest their FSC fish. So there have been concerns raised about the department removing licenses from the commercial fishery through buyback programs, the potential that First Nation commercial harvesters in some of these communities may give up their licenses, which may impair some of these marine area groups or limit their abilities to access their FSC fish. So there are a range of perspectives on that issues depending on where you are.
That's a very helpful overview. I know we're going to spend a little more time in the future on this more specifically, so I'll move on, but I'm grateful for your strategic level comments. I just had one final question, and that's around managing to numbers, and in particular, as I understand it from your evidence right now, that you're managing roughly to a 1 million FSC allocation. When you manage for numbers like that, do you take into consideration the abundance that's necessary if First Nations wants to exercise their rights based on their preferred methods like a dip net and the necessary abundance that would be required in order to catch their FSC, or are you managing really to the numbers that you're expecting them to catch?
We manage to the number.
Those are all my questions, Mr. Commissioner.
Mr. Commissioner, I don't know if you had any questions arising.
I'm not sure if it's a question so much as it is just some assistance in terms of clarification. I think, as you both know, this commission has heard a great deal of evidence so far, and there's more to come about the wild salmon policy. And in the last few days, we've heard from Mr. Lapointe and yourselves about the operational side of the PSC and, of course, the committees and working groups that you've mentioned. What's not clear to me is when the wild salmon policy is fully implemented, how will it change, alter, amend, modify all of these operational structures that you've discussed here in the last couple of days? You haven't made reference very often to the wild salmon policy in your answers, and I'm not faulting you for that. It's because the questions put to you were really directed to the current operational structure. But to the extent that that policy has been embraced by stakeholders and the DFO, and to the extent that it's moving forward with the CUs and benchmarks and other steps to be taken in the future, what changes might take place? The other, for clarification, you might help me on is this. You've talked about on-the-ground discussions that go on through the meetings and through the structure to gain input from stakeholders with regard to operational matters. Is there a process within the DFO for examining the structures themselves, that is the operational structures, to annually or biannually or from time to time explore how to engage some of the comments that are made to you about perhaps changing those structures? In other words, is the wild salmon policy the answer to that? In other words, it did look at everything and determine that the wild salmon policy would be the next kind of era for the DFO in terms of managing the fishery? Or is there some other process going on to be constantly ensuring that the structure is addressing the kinds of points that you hear about from the stakeholders and at your different levels of discussion?
I think there's a large number of issues that we're working on and have been for a long period of time. In my experience in the department is that you're not moving down one track of managing, in this case, Fraser sockeye, and then decide to change abruptly between years. Most of the changes are based on input that are making corrections in the direction that you're heading, as opposed to you're totally going in a different direction altogether. So that being said, things where the wild salmon policy is going to be key in moving forward and giving us more focus of the kinds of changes that we've been striving for, is strategy 4 will be huge. It's about bringing together all the various points of view and explicitly defining what are the trade-offs and what's the overall objective going to be in that year, or in not on a year by year and heavy to conservation this year and more to harvesting next year or whatever, but you have these longer term objectives. This is my view of what will come out of this. And so things like the integrated harvest planning committee is exactly the kinds of things that are envisioned, but to get that functioning, you have to get everybody in that room, mandated, understanding what they're bringing together. And we've been talking quite a bit about First Nations here today, and at this point that's a huge piece that's lacking. So where the wild salmon policy cannot define the native rights in whatever they might be, there has to be some process that has to come in there, so you have to have that kind of a link. And that is going on in other places, the department and the government, to what should happen in those places. That needs to be brought into this. But I think trying to get these forums where people are coming together with that kind of decision-making trade-off ability, as opposed to right now, a lot of this stuff is quite adversarial, where people want to come and give their view. Like, it has to be this way and nothing else, and somebody else is is not on the same page. So the department is stuck trying to make these trade-offs, as it was described to some degree this morning. In more specific kinds of actions is that we've moved from managing Fraser as one population and up until the mid-'80s, and then it was in 2 populations, and over time we've moved to 4, and at one point we had 5. Although only 4 are defined in the Pacific Salmon Treaty, one population, in this case Birkenhead, was removed for 5 or 6 years from that structure of 4 and into 5. And whether we'll end up with 19 or 30 or whatever it might be, I'd be surprised that we would have 30 explicit management objectives across, in the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan. But you'll be much more explicit, like we are with cultists today, where we are managing that stock separately in Canada, not internationally, making sure that you make links so that you don't make rules in Canada that would be contrary to the Salmon Treaty implementation side, or that the treaty is doing something that would compromise Canada. So, in that case, is we've moved to an explicit decision rule. People can follow it. It's a small population size, so here's what the proxy is. Here's how we're going to make our decision rules. Here's what we're going to do, working our way through. And I think you're going to see more of that. And where that comes together, where that comes together in whether it's in the Pacific Salmon Treaty or in the domestic side of things, we have some of this already in Coho in the Chapter 5, I think it is, of the Pacific Salmon Treaty. And in there we've defined management units, both in Canada and the US, and we have explicit sets of rules that if you have one stock in trouble, you'll take X level of actions. If you have 2 stocks in trouble, you'll take X plus something, and 3. So you get into a defined process where people understand that it's not in anybody's benefit to get into having more stocks in trouble, and you're only worried about what's the large one, for example. And some people are focused on that. They can see that there's consequences if we keep trying to push up against some boundary that some of them bring interest for. So we've talked about how we might bring some of that together in the Fraser sockeye side of it. The CU status accounting, I think, will be clear to people, and whether the issues we run into this a lot is that we spend a lot of time on the harvesting aspects, but people if they think that they are less interested in trying to take the action, it's the ocean is causing the problem, or it's a water issue up country, or it's something else. And so why should I give up some harvesting now if we get, and not if, when we get all of these status reports around the habitat and understand specifically the issues. Again, cultists is the example we've got so far, and it's not the formal status as the one gentleman asked about yesterday. I don't think we've got to that point yet, but we've got a habitat paper where you can start to see that if there's many people thought it was water quality in the lake, others said it was the logging that was going on, and others thought whatever the issues they brought forward. So you start to be able to work your way through and define, is there a place here where we need to take specific actions, or that the actions we might we're doing now in our overall habitat management are enough, but there's something that you need to do specifically. And in the case of cultists, they were able to identify 2 areas of work, the milfoil and the pike minnow. And interestingly, the work they were doing on the milfoil was probably causing more problems, but not necessarily helping to solve the problems. So you get, you're adaptive and iterative, working your way through. So I think bringing together these stock objectives, CU objectives, with habitat, understanding more explicitly where you might want to take given actions, but then having defined rules. And to me, it doesn't mean manage them individual stocks. I did have a role in some of the drafting of the wild salmon policy, and I never envisioned, and I don't think others did, that we would be down to managing CU by CU, but rather the aggregates. And so we started some work on that in the last 2 years in the Fraser panel, and I haven't got a clue whether Mike LaPointe gave a presentation here or not, but it was information that I provided, and I believe the Salmon Commission did, into this collection of data. And so we, trying to get people to get away from thinking that one stock, has a certain timing or should be in a certain group. We hear a lot of people saying, move stock X from the early summers to the summer. And so we put together a table of the 19 populations where we had good data, and into a table, and just numbered them 1 to 19, I think it was, and asked people, make your own stock groupings from what you see in the migration timing, and whether you should have whatever. You could go from 1 to 19. Interestingly, some people, without even looking at the overlap in timing, said we want 19 back, and most people didn't know which stock was which. But when we went through and started grouping them, when you looked at the timing, it came out to 4 or 5, as most people said 4 or 5. And there is stocks that need to be moved around from the groupings we're doing today. So we've got a plan to try to implement that through some of the changes we're making in the Fisheries model. It's one of the action items we've got with that group. So there's places here where we can make some changes. So they're all really driven by the issues in the wild salmon policy, the initiatives we've been thinking about. Your comment that we didn't specifically mention it, I think this comes back as in the forecasting questions. We don't do a very good job of telling people why we're making the changes, maybe, or that we get that linkage so that people understand and want to be a part of that change. You're not doing. I've heard this a lot, actually, even in the last few months. You're not doing any wild salmon policy implementation. I strongly disagree. I think there's a lot of things. We're definitely not at the level where it's all there and we have all this information. I think we've been overwhelmed by the complexity of some of the information we've been collecting. And even in this benchmark paper, we thought we knew where we were going and which model and how this would play out. And we sent it back to the authors that they need to do a lot more, and they might not even from science give us a specific, you should use a Larkin model or Larkin model modified in a certain way. Jeff's much more up on this than I am, but the part that struck me was the managers are still going to have to go and try to potentially pick which one of these might be the way you want to, which model you might want to use, and I'm not certain that it would even be the same for each stock, because they don't seem to perform equally in the information they give you. So it's I think we're implementing the wild salmon policy. It would be nice if it was faster. You definitely have to have more resources and time commitment to it, but we're also making changes ourselves where it just is part of our business. And this is what, to me, it should be, is that it should just be how we do our work. Like, I don't tell people that each time I'm meeting with them that I'm doing this because of the allocation policy. That's been around long enough now that everybody expects that that's why you're making decisions the way you are.
A couple points to what Barry said. I think Barry gave a very comprehensive answer. I would agree with Barry that on the wild salmon policy that continues to be the key policy for the department in terms of moving forward. You may also have heard about fisheries renewal nationally and the key objective of sustainable fisheries there. And there's a suite of papers that support that, one of which is the precautionary approach, which specifically cites the wild salmon policy as the way we're going to implement that for Pacific salmon. So I think, as Barry stated, it's going to be a key policy moving forward. I agree with Barry that the resolution and discussion of the scale of management of the different sockeye CUs is going to be continue to be something that's debated and probably contentious. I think one of the important elements of the policy is the open and transparent process we use to deal with that. I think Barry alluded to it, but we've got a number of sophisticated tools that have been developed for dealing with a number of these issues, from forecasting to the Fraser sockeye spawning initiative. For those to be effective in your process, though, you have to have a technical capacity to explain what those results mean, and that includes departmental people that can understand it and explain it to their clients, but also a way to take that information and put it out there in layman's terms, in terms of what does it mean to my fishery this summer. And I think that's one of the key challenges with doing some of the strategy 4 work and assessing options and outcomes and coming to decisions in an open and transparent way. There's a lot of sophisticated work that can be done to support some of that analysis, and we really need to try and support the capacity to understand that. So maybe I'll finish by saying there are some other programs the department's got, including Pacific Fisheries Reform and PICFI, where we're trying to align what we're doing there, I think, are consistent with what we're trying to do in the wild salmon policy. So PICFI's got some elements around capacity building and co-management, which I think are going to be important elements implementing the wild salmon policy, as well as providing certainty and stability around shares in the fisheries. And I think having some certainty and stability around what those shares are will help the participants align their interests with the long-term directions with the wild salmon policy as well. I know those are topics that are going to be discussed later, I think, but I just thought I'd link those in as well.
Well, I think that Canada has at least one re-examination question, and I don't know before we do that, though, if there's any questions arising, maybe we should do that before Canada does any re-exam. Nobody's jumping to their feet, so I think maybe Canada can start its re-exam.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Hugh McCauley for the Government of Canada. With me again is Jonas Spiegelman. Mr. Grout and Mr. Rosenberger, I have just one clarification question arising from questions put to you yesterday, I think it was, by Mr. Leadham and Mr. Rosenblum. And I'd asked Mr. Lund to pull up Exhibit 327, sorry about that. The handwritten comment that we've focused some attention on, it reads to me, need to ensure we maximize opportunities for commercial fisheries. I noted in reviewing that there's no specific reference to Fraser sockeye. The question for you, Mr. Grout, perhaps, and Mr. Rosenberg, I welcome you to add to this, but the approval that's being sought here and provided by the Minister is for both the IFMP, the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan, for the north and for the south for salmon fisheries in British Columbia. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. If you look at the top of the page under recommendations and next steps, we're seeking the recommendation from the Minister, or support for the recommendation that the IFMPs be approved for both northern BC and southern BC. So the comment around maximizing opportunities for commercial fisheries could be implied to pertain to any commercial fisheries, I think, that relate to either northern and southern BC as laid out in the management plans.
When, I'm sorry, I will mispronounce her last name, so I'll say Council for Fisheries Survival Coalition, was asking you questions about pre-season forecasts. She she asked you some questions about how there'd been a paradigm shift in how the forecast was done in 2010, and there's some discussion around that. And then she, at the very end of that series of questions, she said, and then when this gets incorporated into Frizzy. And I just wanted to clarify, the preseason forecast work that's done by Sue Grant relies on the data set with respect to the 19 stocks where you have a spawner-recruit relationship, correct?
That's correct.
And that same data set is used in developing the Frizzy models, right?
That's correct.
Does the preseason forecast itself get used in Frizzy?
No, it does not.
Okay, thank you. So they use the same data set, but they're two different models for two different purposes.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Those are all the questions, that I had. If there's no other questions, we were unable to rustle up another witness for this afternoon, so I'm sorry about that. We will have to take the afternoon off and restart tomorrow morning with Sue Grant. Oh, and I don't know if we need to discuss this on the record or not, but there was an earthquake preparedness thing that was circulated this morning, which suggests that if we want to, we can participate in a province-wide earthquake preparedness thing at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, and I don't know if we have a decision on whether you want to do that or not. I'm very concerned about how much time we have for the second part of the hearing, so my preference would be just to do that in spirit, but not in reality.
Yes, Mr. Registrar did bring me the document that you're referring to. I don't know if other council have seen it. It is an earthquake preparedness. I believe it's Lower Mainland, or is it province-wide? I'm not sure.
I'm not
but
sure.
In any event, I'm content that everybody read the document and be aware of the well-intentioned operation that is crucial for all of us. But I think if council are prepared, I'm prepared to proceed tomorrow morning with Ms. Grant and move forward with that evidence.
Thank you.
And people during the day can duck under any desk or wall frame they might choose to do so. I think that's a good practice for all of us.
We do it at the break.
Before we break this afternoon, I wanted to thank Mr. Grout and Mr. Rosenberger for their attendance here and for the past several days and for their answers to council. And I want to thank council for for the most part, sticking very closely to your time estimates, which is very critical to our ability to move forward with what's going to be an even heavier list of witnesses in the next couple of weeks. So thank you very much for all of your cooperation in that regard. And again, thank you to our witnesses. Thank you very much.
Hearing is now adjourned for the day and resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.